It all started with the sound of breaking glass, a sound that didn't happen. I know how that sounds. Crazy. But as a quantum physicist, I've learned that reality is a lot less solid than we think. It's more of a suggestion. Really. That night, the suggestion was that my world was about to shatter. I was asleep in my bed, the quiet hum of the building's climate control the only real noise in my small apartment. But in my head, there was a crash, a sharp, crystalline explosion that jolted me awake, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was pitch black, silent, no broken window, no fallen picture frame. Just me, tangled in my sheets, drenched in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. My name is Frank Lancaster, and I was, at that time, a man obsessed. My obsession had a name, the Genesis engine. It was my life's work, a machine that promised to rewrite the very code of life. And apparently, it was already haunting my dreams. I closed my eyes, trying to will my heart rate back to something resembling normal. But the dream was still there, seared onto the back of my eyelids. It wasn't just a dream, it was a hall of mirrors in my own mind. I was standing in a room, a circular, sterile chamber that rotated slowly, endlessly. And in it were dozens of me, an infinity of Franks, all looking back at me with my own eyes. They were holding hands, a chain of Lancaster duplicates, their lips moving in a silent, terrifying chorus. As the room spun, their whisper grew louder, a psychic hiss that wormed its way into my skull. "You killed us." The words were a venomous tide, rising with each rotation. They weren't angry, not really. They were just stating a fact from a future I hadn't lived yet. Then, one of them stepped forward. This Frank was different. Her hair was longer, catching some unseen light, and her frame was softer, more slender. She was a woman. As she got closer, I saw her eyes. They were a shocking, impossible shade of violet, and they burned with a cold fire. She reached out, her fingers long and delicate, and wrapped them around my throat. Her grip was like steel. "Stop, Genesis," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo of my own, yet feminine, melodic. "Stop it before you destroy everything." I shot up in bed, gasping for air that wasn't there. My throat ached from her phantom grip. The dream faded, leaving behind the bitter taste of adrenaline and fear. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet finding the cool wood of the floor. My lab coat was draped over my desk chair, and next to it, spread out under the glow of a single desk lamp, were the blueprints for the Genesis engine. My magnum opus. Something was wrong. A dark, jagged line cut across the intricate schematics. I stumbled over to the desk, my hands trembling. It was a smear of blood. Fresh and wet, glistening under the light. It looked like someone had dragged their bleeding fingernails across the paper. A desperate, tearing motion. My first instinct was to check my own hands. I turned them over, examining each finger. Nothing. No cuts. No scrapes. Not a single broken nail. The blood wasn't mine. A wave of dread, cold and heavy, washed over me. I wasn't alone. My roommate, Gary, was here. My mind, still fuzzy from sleep and terror, latched onto that single, rational thought I had to check on him. I crept out of my bedroom, my bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. The apartment was small. Just 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a shared living room that bled into a tiny kitchenette. The living room was dark, but the pale, sterile light of a street lamp filtered through the large window, casting long shadows across the furniture. And that's when I saw him. Gary was asleep on the sofa. That wasn't unusual. He often crashed there after a long shift at the diner. What was unusual? What made the air freeze in my lungs? Was what he was wearing? He was curled on his side, his back to me, but even in the dim light, I could see the soft, unmistakable sheen of silk. A dress. It was a delicate, powder pink slip dress, the kind with thin spaghetti straps that looked impossibly fragile against his shoulders. I took a step closer, my scientific curiosity battling with a profound sense of shock and intrusion. As I rounded the edge of the sofa, the full picture came into view, and it was like getting hit by a stun gun. Gary's face, usually so boyish and plain, was transformed. He had makeup on. His lips, parted slightly in sleep, were painted a soft, glossy pink that had smudged a little at the corner. His eyelashes, long and dark, were impossibly thick and curled, fanning out against his cheek, a pair of false lashes. I realized one was slightly askew. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my brain struggling to process the scene. This was Gary Walker, my friend, the guy I watched football with, the guy who could eat an entire pizza by himself, the guy who was, for all intents and purposes, a completely average dude. And here he was, asleep in a silk dress and lipstick, looking beautiful and vulnerable, so inedibly vulnerable. My dreams slammed back into my consciousness with the force of a physical blow, the woman with the violet eyes, the warning, the blood on my schematics. And now this. It felt connected. Somehow. Like the universe was trying to tell me something. Screaming it at me through nightmares and surreal midnight scenes. I looked from Gary's peaceful, painted face to the closed door of my bedroom, where the Genesis engine blueprints lay stained with blood. My creation. My obsession. A machine designed to rewrite the code of life. A thought, dangerous and seductive, began to form in the quiet chaos of my mind. It was a terrible, thrilling idea, a spark of mad science that felt more like a divine revelation. I looked at Gary, sleeping in his secret skin, a person clearly yearning to be something else. If I could help him, if I could truly help him write himself anew. What if Genesis wasn't for curing diseases or fixing genetic flaws? What if its true purpose was something far more profound? What if the Genesis engine could make Gary happy? The thought was a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. It was the beginning of everything, the beginning of the echo, the genesis of a love I could never have imagined and a catastrophe that would ripple across worlds. The morning sun streamed through the living room window, and with it came the awkward, suffocating weight of reality. I had retreated to my room after my discovery. My mind racing too fast for sleep, I sat at my desk, staring at the blood-smeared blueprint. The image of Gary in the pink dress burned into my vision. I didn't clean the blood. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. It felt like evidence, though of what? I wasn't sure. I heard a soft stirring from the other room. A muffled groan. My stomach twisted into a knot. What was I supposed to do? Pretend I hadn't seen anything that felt dishonest. Cowardly even. Confront him. The thought of the shame that would flood his face made me feel sick. I decided to just act normal. I got up, stretched, and walked into the kitchenette to start the coffee maker. The machine's gurgle a welcome, mundane sound in the tense silence. A few moments later, Gary shuffled into the room. He was back in his usual attire, an oversized, worn-out t-shirt and plaid pajama pants. But the evidence of the night before was still there. A faint pinkish smudge remained on his lips, and a tiny fleck of glitter clung to his cheekbone. His eyes were puffy, and he refused to look at me, focusing intently on the floor as he moved towards the bathroom. The silence stretched. Thick and uncomfortable, the coffee maker hissed and sputtered. Finishing its cycle, I poured 2 mugs, my hands feeling clumsy. When Gary came back out, his face was scrubbed clean, raw and red from the effort. He still wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stood there, his shoulders hunched, radiating a palpable aura of humiliation. I took a breath. I had to say something. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I pushed a mug of coffee across the counter towards him. "Sleep okay?" He flinched at the simple question. He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with so much misery it was like a punch to the gut. "Frank!" He trailed off, his voice cracking. He shook his head, looking down again. I'm so sorry. You weren't supposed to see that. I'll pack my stuff. I can be out by this afternoon. The words hit me harder than I expected. The thought of him leaving, of him carrying this shame out the door and disappearing from my life, felt wrong, utterly wrong. Whoa, hey, stop, I said, walking around the counter to stand in front of him. Gary, look at me. He hesitated, then slowly lifted his head. You don't have to apologize for anything, I said, keeping my voice steady and calm. And you're not going anywhere. A tear spilled from his eye and traced a path down his cheek. But you saw. I saw you sleeping on the couch, I said simply. Then I took a risk. And you know what? You looked beautiful. I'm not kidding. The shock on his face was immediate. His mouth opened slightly. A mix of disbelief and a fragile, dawning hope. He'd expected disgust, mockery, anger. He had not expected a compliment. You don't think I'm a freak, he whispered, his voice trembling. No, Gary. I don't, I said. And I meant it. In the light of day, the shock had faded, replaced by a profound sense of empathy. And beneath that, the dangerous idea from last night was stirring. Growing stronger, I think you're my friend. And if this is a part of you, then I want to understand it. That was all it took. The dam broke. He slumped onto one of the kitchen stools, burying his face in his hands as quiet, ragged sobs shook his body. I just stood there, placing a hand gently on his shoulder, letting him cry it out. When the tears finally subsided, he began to talk, and it all came pouring out. A lifetime of secrets and repressed desires whispered into the sterile quiet of our kitchen. He told me he'd always felt this way, for as long as he could remember. A feeling of being in the wrong body. A fundamental disconnect between the person he was inside and the reflection he saw in the mirror. He talked about how he was drawn to dresses in store windows, the way the fabric moved, the way it promised a different kind of existence. He confessed to stealing his sister's makeup in middle school, just to see what it felt like. He described the secret joy and the crushing shame of it all. The thrill of putting on a skirt for the first time in the privacy of his locked bedroom. The soft fabric against his legs feeling more right than anything ever had. The terror of being discovered. The years spent pushing it all down. Trying to be the normal guy everyone expected him to be. I've never told anyone, he said, his voice raw. I feel like I was supposed to be a girl. Frank. I like the idea of it. I like the clothes. The makeup. The idea of having a body that's soft and gentle and mine. He gestured vaguely at his own chest. But I've never had the courage to go further than this. Just dressing up in the dark. It's pathetic. It's not pathetic, I said firmly. It's brave as hell. He gave a weak, watery smile. Thanks. Frank. I listened to every word, my expression one of sympathetic concern. I was a good friend. But inside, my mind was a whirlwind. Every word he spoke was another piece of data, another confirmation, soft, gentle, a body that's mine. He wasn't just talking about clothes. He was talking about a fundamental state of being. He was describing a biological reality that didn't match his own. My work. The Genesis engine. It could do more than just fix a broken strand of DNA. In theory, its quantum resonance field could initiate a cascading biorestructuring. It could, with the right inputs, rewrite an entire genome. It could change everything. The dream, the violet-eyed woman, her warning to stop Genesis. It felt like a distant echo now, drowned out by the overwhelming, immediate possibility sitting right in front of me. Gary's pain was real. His desire was real. And I had the power to give him what he truly wanted. Was it dangerous? Absolutely. The system was unstable, untested on a full-scale biological matrix. The blood on the blueprint was a stark reminder of that. But the potential, the chance to make him whole, to see the person he described emerge from the shell he was trapped in, it was the most compelling experiment I could ever conceive. It was more than science. It felt like destiny. I let him finish, let the silence settle between us again. This time, a comfortable, shared quiet. The secret was out, and our friendship had survived. It had deepened. I stood up, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating purpose. The decision was made. "Gary," I said, my voice low and steady, "come with me. There's something I have to show you." He looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and trust. He nodded slowly, wiping the last of the tears from his eyes. I led him away from the kitchen, down the short hallway, to the one door in the apartment that was always locked. My lab. It was a converted second bedroom, crammed with servers, monitors, and the gleaming, chrome and glass heart of it all. As I turned the key and pushed the door open, I knew that whatever happened next, neither of us would ever be the same. The air in my lab was always cool and smelled faintly of ozone and sterile electronics. It was my sanctuary, a place where the chaotic variables of the outside world could be reduced to clean, predictable data. At the center of the room, dominating the space, sat the Genesis engine. It wasn't a massive, sprawling machine like something out of a movie. It was more elegant, more contained, a vertical, human-sized cylindrical pod made of polished chrome and reinforced glass, connected by thick, insulated cables to a bank of humming servers. Inside the pod, a complex array of emitters and sensors was aimed at the exact center. It was beautiful, terrifying, and the culmination of my entire life. Gary stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes wide as he took it all in. He'd seen bits and pieces of my equipment before, but he'd never been inside the lab. He'd respected my privacy, assuming it was just a bunch of complex physics gear he wouldn't understand. He wasn't wrong, but he was about to get the crash course of a lifetime. "Frank, what is all this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "This," I said, gesturing to the pod, "is the Genesis engine." I walked him through it, keeping my explanation as simple as I could, my voice filled with the passion and certainty of a true believer. I told him about my theories on quantum entanglement and biological data, how I believed DNA wasn't just a chemical blueprint, but a quantum state that could be influenced, even rewritten. Think of the human genome like a massive, incredibly complex line of code, I explained, pointing to a string of data, scrolling on one of the monitors. Medical science right now is like a programmer who can only fix typos. They can target a single gene, snip out a faulty piece, maybe replace it. It's incredible, but it's limited. What I've been working on is different. I looked at him, trying to gauge his understanding. His face was a mask of concentration, his earlier sadness replaced by a dawning sense of awe. The Genesis engine doesn't just edit the code, I continued, my voice dropping with intensity. It creates a quantum resonance field that allows us to rewrite the entire document. It doesn't just heal, it can fundamentally change the instructions that tell a body how to be. It can alter bone density, muscle structure, nerve pathways, everything. I paused, letting the weight of my next words land, including biological sex. Gary stared at me, his mouth agape, the color drained from his face. Hope and fear warred in his eyes, a violent, silent conflict. He understood. He understood exactly what I was offering. "You're telling me that thing, that machine," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the pod. It can make me a woman." "Theoretically," I said, the word feeling flimsy and inadequate. "It could rewrite your genetic markers, trigger a complete hormonal and physiological cascade. It would be a total biological transformation, right down to the cellular level." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the gleaming machine. He walked slowly around it, tracing the lines of the chrome with his fingertips as if testing to see if it were real. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the servers. Then he turned to me, his eyes shining with an intensity I had never seen before. It was the look of a drowning man who had just been thrown a life raft. "Frank," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, let me try. Please, Frank." He took a step closer, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I have to. I've spent my whole life feeling like a ghost in my own skin. If there is even a chance, just one chance for me to be myself, I have to take it." His voice broke, and the request became a desperate, ragged plea. "Please, just once. Let me be me." My own internal conflict was a raging storm. The dream, the warning, the blood. Every rational part of my brain screamed that this was reckless, that the technology was unstable. I was risking his life on an unproven theory. But then I looked at his face, at the raw, desperate yearning in his eyes, and the scientist in me was overwhelmed by the friend. How could I deny him this? How could I, holding the keys to the kingdom he so desperately wanted to enter, turn him away? I couldn't. "Okay," I breathed. "Okay. Gary, we'll do it." A sob of pure relief escaped his lips. He lunged forward and wrapped me in a hug, clinging to me as if I were the only solid thing in his world. I held him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his back. What was I doing? I was playing God. And a part of me, a dark, arrogant part, was thrilled by the very idea. An hour later, the preparations began. The process itself would take several hours, and Gary was insistent on one point. "If this works," he said, his voice resolute, "I want to come out of that machine and already be her. I want the first moment of my new life to be the right one." He wanted to go into the Genesis engine already dressed. It was an intimate, strange, and profoundly moving request. He brought out a small, carefully packed box from under his bed. It was his secret collection. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were the components of a new identity. We stood in his bedroom, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over everything. The atmosphere was charged, a mix of nervous energy and sacred ritual. He started with a bra. It was made of delicate white lace, beautiful and fragile. He held it up, then looked at me, a flicker of his old shyness returning. "Can you?" he asked, turning around. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. My fingers felt thick and clumsy as I took the straps. I fumbled with the small hooks and eyes, my knuckles brushing against the skin of his back. His skin was warm. I finally managed to secure the clasp, and he turned back around. The empty lace cups sat awkwardly against his flat, muscular chest. He looked down at them, a sad, hopeful smile on his face. Next were the panties, a simple pair made of soft, cool satin. He slipped them on, and as he did, he let out a soft, involuntary hiss of pleasure. "It's the feel of it," he whispered, as if to himself. "It just feels right." Then came the stockings. They were a sheer, nude color. He sat on the edge of his bed and carefully rolled one up his leg, his movements practiced and loving. The thin nylon compressed his skin, smoothing over the hair on his legs, instantly creating the illusion of a softer, more feminine shape. He shivered as the stocking top, with its band of silicone, gripped his upper thigh. "It's like a second skin," he murmured, his eyes closed. I watched him, fascinated. This wasn't just about clothing. This was an act of becoming. Each piece of fabric was a prayer, a step closer to the person he was meant to be. My role shifted from scientist to something else entirely. I was a witness, an accomplice, a facilitator of a sacred transformation. And as I watched him, something inside me shifted, too. The clinical detachment I usually maintained began to crumble. I wasn't just observing a subject anymore. I was seeing Gary, truly seeing him for the first time. The way the light caught the curve of his calf in the sheer nylon, The vulnerability in the line of his neck, the quiet grace in his movements. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest. He was beautiful. Not just in a "you look nice" way, but in a way that was deep, profound, and utterly captivating. He could be astonishingly beautiful. Finally. He stood up and dared to reach for the last item. It was the pink silk dress from the night before. He slipped it over his head, and the fabric cascaded down his body, settling over the alien landscape of the lace bra and satin panties. He turned to me, his hands smoothing down the silk over his hips. "Well," he asked, his voice a nervous whisper. I could only stare, my breath caught in my throat. He was no longer just Gary in a dress. He was a figure of profound potential. A living, breathing promise of what the Genesis engine could do. "You're ready," I said. My voice hoarse. "It's time." The hum of the lab equipment seemed to grow louder, more expectant, as Gary, dressed and ready for his rebirth, stepped towards the Genesis engine. His bare feet were silent on the cold tile floor. He paused at the threshold of the pod, turning to look at me one last time. The fear in his eyes was palpable, but beneath it was a bedrock of sheer, unshakable resolve. "Whatever happens." "Frank," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you." "Just breathe." "Gary," I said, trying to keep my own voice from shaking. "I'll be right here." He gave me a small, trembling nod, then stepped inside the glass cylinder. I sealed the door, the heavy pneumatic hiss sounding like a final, irreversible judgment. Inside. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped in front of him. The pink silk of his dress, a stark splash of color against the sterile chrome and white light. I moved to the main console, my fingers flying across the keyboard, initiating the final pre-sequence checks. Vitals stable, power levels optimal, quantum field emitters calibrated. Everything was green. There was no reason to stop, no logical flaw in the procedure. Only the ghost of a violet-eyed woman whispering warnings in the back of my mind. I silenced her. This was happening. "Initiating sequence," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. I pressed the final command key. The change was immediate. The lights inside the pod intensified, shifting from a clinical white to a brilliant, electric blue. The hum of the servers rose in pitch to a high-frequency whine. The emitters lining the pod began to glow, projecting intricate, overlapping beams of light that wrapped around Gary's body like a luminous cocoon. The light wasn't just light, it seemed to have substance, weaving and unweaving in patterns that resembled living, breathing DNA helices. Gary's eyes were squeezed shut. His knuckles were white, where he gripped his hands together. I watched his vitals on the monitor. My heart pounding in time with the frantic pulse line. It spiked, then began to fluctuate wildly. "Gary, can you hear me? Talk to me. What do you feel?" I asked, but my voice tight. A strangled gasp came over the intercom. "It's everywhere," he rasped. "I feel, pulled, like I'm being stretched apart and squeezed together all at once." The blue light intensified, and his body began to tremble, then convulse. An alarm blared on the console, massive cellular degradation followed by instantaneous regeneration. It was working. The machine was breaking him down and rebuilding him, cell by cell. It was a horrifying, miraculous thing to witness. I could see the changes happening. Subtle at first, then rapid and dramatic. His shoulders seemed to narrow, the bones themselves shifting under his skin. His waist cinched, and his hips widened. The silk of the dress pulling taut over new curves that hadn't existed seconds before. His skin seemed to glow from within, losing its rougher texture and becoming smooth, luminous. The faint shadow of stubble on his jaw vanished, replaced by soft, flawless skin. His hands, still clenched, became smaller, his fingers more slender. The most dramatic change was his hair. It began to grow, spilling over his shoulders, down his back, lengthening at a physically impossible rate. It cascaded downwards, a river of rich, brown silk. He threw his head back, a cry tearing from his throat. But it wasn't his voice anymore. It was higher, clearer, and unmistakably female. It was a cry of agony and ecstasy. The sound of a soul being forged anew in the crucible of science. I watched, breathless, as a new sensation registered on the biomonitors. Mammary tissue development. She gasped, her hands flying up to clutch at her chest as breasts began to form, pushing against the white lace of her bra, filling the cups until they were perfectly, naturally full. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The light faded back to a soft white. The whine of the machine subsided to its normal hum. The alarms on my console fell silent. All her vitals were stable, strong, and entirely female. Inside the pod, a woman stood where my friend had been. She was trembling, her head bowed, her long brown hair hiding her face. She was soft, delicate, and so beautiful it made my chest ache. The pneumatic lock hissed as the door slid open. The cool air of the lab washed over her, and she shivered. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes, still Gary's familiar shade of brown, were wide with wonder and disbelief. She took a tentative step out of the pod, her balance unsure on a body with a new center of gravity. She looked down at her hands, turning them over and over. She touched her face, her slender fingers tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her lips. Then, with a shaking hand, she reached up and cupped one of her new breasts, a choked sob escaping her lips. The feeling was real. This was her body. "Frank," she whispered, and her voice was music. It was soft, a little breathless, and utterly feminine. "Frank, it's me. I'm real." She looked up at me, tears of joy streaming down her face, and the full force of what I had done hit me. I had not just changed a person, I had unveiled one. I had brought a soul into the light. She needed a name. Gary was a ghost, a memory. "What do you want to be called?" I asked gently. She thought for a moment, a small radiant smile playing on her lips. "Gia," she said. "My name is Gia." The name was perfect. It suited her. And without thinking, without any conscious control over my own mouth, I voiced the thought that was screaming in my head. "Gia," I breathed, the name feeling foreign and wonderful on my tongue. "You're as beautiful as an angel." Her smile widened, and in that moment, under the sterile lights of my lab, I felt something shift in the universe. It wasn't the hum of the machine, or the crackle of quantum energy. It was the silent, terrifying, and exhilarating sensation of falling in love. The first week of Gia's new life was a blur of discovery, a whirlwind of firsts that was both enchanting and overwhelming. It was like living with a newborn in an adult's body. Every sensation, every experience, was brand new. Our small apartment transformed from a simple bachelor pad into a cocoon of learning and exploration. The first thing she had to learn was how to walk. Her new body had a different balance, a different rhythm. Her hips were wider, her stride naturally shorter. She would stumble, her steps clumsy and uncertain, and I would catch her, my hands steady on her new, softer waist. "It's like my legs are connected differently," she'd say, laughing with a mix of frustration and delight. I taught her to walk from her hips, to let her body sway naturally. Within a few days, she was moving with a tentative grace that grew more confident with every step. The clumsy shuffle was replaced by a fluid, gentle glide that was mesmerizing to watch. Her fascination with her new form was endless. She'd spend hours in front of the bathroom mirror, not out of vanity, but out of sheer wonder. She'd touch her face, her collarbones, the curve of her stomach. She was a cartographer charting a new and beautiful continent. "Look," Frank. She'd call me over, her voice filled with childlike excitement. I have freckles on my shoulders I never had before, and my ears are smaller. Clothing became a universe of its own. Her old male wardrobe was packed away into boxes and shoved into the back of a closet, a relic of a past life. We went on a shopping trip, her first as a woman. It was a revelation, seeing her in the harsh fluorescent lighting of a department store, surrounded by other women. She didn't look out of place. She belonged. She nervously browsed the racks, her fingers tracing the different textures, the roughness of denim, the smoothness of cotton, the ethereal softness of chiffon. In the dressing room, she tried on everything. She discovered the simple joy of a well-fitting pair of jeans, the way they hugged her new hips. She delighted in the swirl of a sundress, spinning in front of the mirror, the fabric flaring out around her. Her greatest joy, however, was in the lingerie department. The sheer variety of colors, fabrics, and styles overwhelmed her. She held up a silk chemise, her eyes wide. "This is what I want to feel against my skin every day," she whispered, more to herself than to me. I stood awkwardly outside the dressing room, my arms loaded with her selections, feeling like a clumsy, out-of-place guardian. But hearing her happy, musical laughter from behind the curtain made it all worth it. Our dynamic shifted entirely. The easy, brotherly friendship we'd had as Frank and Gary was gone. In its place, something far more complex and intimate was growing. The lines were blurring. I was her creator, sir. Her guide, her protector, and her best friend. All at once, the physical awareness between us was a constant, low-level hum. When I helped her zip up a dress, my fingers brushing the warm, smooth skin of her back. When she'd grab my arm for balance, her touch sending a jolt through me. One evening, she was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by her new makeup collection, looking completely lost. She held up an eyeliner pencil like it was a dangerous weapon. "I have no idea what I'm doing," she confessed, pouting. I sat down across from her. "Here. Let me," I said. Surprising myself, I'd watched my sister do her makeup 1,000 times growing up. I took the pencil, my touch gentle as I tilted her chin up. Her eyes were wide and trusting as she looked at me. Her face was inches from mine. I could see the tiny gold flecks in her brown eyes, smell the faint, clean scent of her skin. My hand was shaking slightly as I carefully drew a thin line along her upper lash line. "There," I said, my voice a little hoarse. "Now the other one." She didn't move. She just kept looking at me, her gaze intense. "Thank you, Frank," she said softly. The air between us was thick, charged with unspoken words and feelings I didn't dare to name. I was falling for her, hard and fast, and the realization terrified me. She was my friend. She was my creation. It was a mess of ethical and emotional tripwires, and I didn't know how to navigate it. But my growing feelings were overshadowed by a constant, nagging worry. The Genesis engine was a prototype, a brilliant, successful prototype, but a prototype nonetheless. The transformation had been seamless, but I knew the quantum matrix that held her new form stable was fragile. It needed reinforcement. I had been working on a software update, a patch that would solidify the changes, making them permanent and irreversible. I didn't tell Gia about this. I didn't want to worry her. I didn't want to introduce the idea that this beautiful new reality could be temporary. I wanted her to live in the magic of her new existence without fear. So, I worked late at night in the lab. After she had gone to sleep, I'd sit at the console, running diagnostics and writing code. The hum of the servers a constant reminder of the delicate balance I was trying to maintain. One night, I was close to a breakthrough. The stabilization patch was almost complete. It was a complex piece of work, designed to fold the new quantum state into the baseline reality of her cells, making her female form as natural and immutable as the color of her eyes. I just needed to run one final simulation. I stood up, stretching the kinks out of my back. From the lab, I could see through the open door into the living room. Gia had fallen asleep on the sofa, a book resting on her chest. She was curled up, looking peaceful and impossibly beautiful in the soft glow of a single lamp. My heart swelled with a fierce, protective love. Everything I was doing was for her. This patch would ensure she would be safe, that she would be Gia. Forever. I turned back to the console. My resolve hardened. I had to finish this. For her. I initiated the final diagnostic sequence, ready to upload the patch. I had no idea I was about to tear a hole in the fabric of the universe. I should have listened to the dream. I should have paid attention to the blood on the blueprint. But I was arrogant. I was in love. It's a dangerous combination. The stabilization patch was ready. The code was elegant. The theory was sound. I initiated the upload, not to the machine itself, but to a closed system simulation matrix designed to mimic Gia's biological quantum state. It was supposed to be a safe. Final test. The moment I hit enter, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. The low hum of the servers instantly escalated into a deafening roar. The lights in the lab flickered violently, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Save for the emergency red lighting and the frantic strobing glow of the Genesis engine itself, the floor began to vibrate, a deep, resonant shaking that rattled my teeth. No, 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 I muttered, my hands flying across the keyboard. Trying to abort the sequence, but the system was locked. A cascade of error messages flooded the screen, lines of code dissolving into meaningless symbols. The Genesis engine was glowing with an unholy purple light. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, crackling with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The smell of ozone was overpowering. In the center of the lab, a few feet in front of the machine, the space itself seemed to tear. It started as a shimmer, like heat haze on a summer road. Then the shimmer coalesced, darkening into a vertical slit of absolute blackness. It widened, splitting the air with a sound like tearing fabric on a cosmic scale. It wasn't a hole, it was a doorway. A gateway into nothingness, bordered by flickering, violent energy. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes as a wave of pressure erupted from the portal. This wasn't part of the program. This was a dimensional breach. My patch hadn't just stabilized the simulation. It had resonated with the engine's core, overloading it and forcing it to punch a hole into somewhere else. And then, someone stepped through. The silhouette was tall, slender, and unmistakably female. She moved with an unnerving calm, stepping out of the chaotic, screaming void and into my lab, as if she were merely crossing a room. The portal snapped shut behind her with a thunderous clap, plunging the lab back into the dim, pulsing red of the emergency lights. The vibrations stopped. The roar of the servers died down to a panicked whine. Silence descended, thick and heavy. The woman stood there, letting her eyes adjust. As the red light washed over her, I could see the details. She was wearing a tailored, dark grey jumpsuit that looked both practical and impossibly stylish. Her hair was cut in a sharp, asymmetrical bob, and it was the same impossible shade of violet as the woman from my dream. Her eyes, when they found mine, were the same color, violet. And they were intelligent, sharp, and utterly devoid of fear. There was a faint, silvery scar on her neck, shaped like a lightning bolt. My blood ran cold. I knew who I was looking at. It was me, a version of me from another reality. The woman from my nightmare. She took a slow, deliberate step towards me. Her expression was unreadable, a cool mask of scientific curiosity and something else, something that looked dangerously like pity. "So," she said, her voice a low, melodic alto that was a strange and perfect echo of my own. "You're the Frank who finally cracked the resonance cascade. I have to admit, I'm a little impressed, and a little horrified." I just stared, my mind unable to form a coherent thought or a single word. She smiled, a small, knowing smirk. Don't worry. The cognitive dissonance will pass. You'll get used to looking at me. She glanced around the lab, her gaze sweeping over my equipment. My monitors. My messy desk. It was the look of an expert appraising the work of a talented but reckless amateur. You've pushed the engine too far. Frank. The stabilization patch created a harmonic frequency that echoed across the multiverse. You're not just rewriting one person, you're sending out ripples that are destabilizing other realities. She paused, her purple eyes locking onto mine again, her expression turning deadly serious. You are destroying the multiverse, and I'm here to stop you. My throat was too dry to speak. My world had tilted on its axis. Multiverse. Echoes. A female version of me standing in my lab. It was too much. Then, a soft voice came from the doorway. Frank, what was that noise? Is everything okay? Gia stood there, silhouetted by the light from the living room. She was clutching a blanket around her shoulders, her hair a messy halo, her face etched with sleep and concern. The woman's head snapped towards the doorway. Her entire demeanor changed. The cool, scientific detachment vanished, replaced by an unnerving stillness, an intensity that was almost predatory. Her violet eyes fixed on Gia. She took in every detail: Gia's soft curves, her frightened expression, the delicate hand clutching the blanket. She was silent for a long, stretched moment. A very long moment. I saw her gaze linger, cataloguing, assessing. It was a look that made a cold dread pool in my stomach. It was a dangerous look. When she finally spoke, her voice was a soft, intrigued purr. Well now, she said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. What do we have here? The woman, this alternate Frank, introduced herself with a chilling lack of ceremony. You can call me Fiona, she said, her violet eyes never leaving Gia. Fiona Lancaster. The next few days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. And I was losing badly. My lab was a neutral zone. The damaged gateway, a silent, ominous reminder of Fiona's arrival. The apartment, however, became a battleground for Gia's attention. And Fiona was an infinitely more skilled tactician than I was. Where I was clumsy and overwhelmed by my feelings for Gia, Fiona was smooth, sophisticated, and possessed an unnerving understanding of the female psyche. She treated Gia not as a miracle or a project, but as a woman. It was a subtle distinction, but it made all the difference. Fiona noticed things I didn't. That shade of blue brings out the gold in your eyes. Gia, she'd comment offhandedly as Gia tried on a new shirt. While I would just say, that looks nice, Fiona would explain why it looked nice, discussing cut, and fabric, and form in a way that made Gia feel seen and understood, not just observed. She knew how to connect with her on a level I couldn't. I'd try to talk to Gia about science or movies, our old shared interests. Fiona would talk to her about the nuances of her new experience. She'd ask about her dreams, about how her senses had changed, about the emotional shifts that came with a completely different hormonal balance. She gave Gia a vocabulary for her feelings, validating her experience in a way I, as a man and her creator, never could. The wedge between me and Gia was driven deeper every day. Fiona was an expert at it. She'd do it with backhanded compliments and subtle digs that always left me on the defensive. One evening, I was helping Gia cook dinner. I was awkwardly chopping vegetables while she stirred a pot on the stove. Fiona leaned against the doorframe, watching us with an amused smirk. It's sweet how you try to take care of her. Frank, Fiona said, her tone dripping with condescension. Like a scientist tending to his most successful experiment. She then looked directly at Gia, her expression softening into one of deep empathy. He sees the process, the data. He's proud of his work. She paused, then delivered the killing blow. But I see the masterpiece. Gia's hand stilled, the spoon frozen in the pot. She looked down, a faint blush on her cheeks. I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Was that all I saw her as, an experiment? The thought was a knife in my gut. Because a small, honest part of me knew it had started that way. I loved her now. But the seed of my actions had been scientific curiosity. Fiona had seen that weakness and was exploiting it perfectly. "That's not true," I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. Fiona just raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, "Isn't it?" Gia grew more and more distant from me, and more drawn to Fiona. Fiona was a siren, luring her in with promises and understanding. She painted a picture of a world, her world, where people with abilities like Gia's were not just accepted, but celebrated. A world where she could be safe, beautiful, and respected, free from the judgment and complications of this one. In my reality, the Genesis technology is perfected, Fiona told her one afternoon while I was forced to listen from the other room. Pretending to work, there are communities, entire cities, for people who choose to redefine themselves. You wouldn't be an anomaly. Gia, you'd be a pioneer. You'd be home. She was seducing Gia, not necessarily physically, but intellectually and emotionally. She offered her a sense of belonging that I, a cisgender man, from a world that barely understood transgender issues, let alone full biological transformation, could never provide. Fiona represented a future of infinite possibility, while I was starting to represent the messy, complicated, and potentially dangerous past. My jealousy was a bitter, corrosive thing. It made me quiet and sullen. I didn't know how to fight Fiona's silver-tongued manipulations. I couldn't offer Gia a utopian society. All I had were my own tangled, unexpressed feelings, which I was too much of a coward to voice. How could I compete with a charismatic, brilliant, female version of myself from a parallel universe? The rift between me and Gia became a chasm. Our easy intimacy was gone, replaced by a polite, painful distance. The shared laughter, the gentle touches, the late-night talks, they all vanished. She started spending more and more time with Fiona, talking in low voices, Fiona's musical alto a constant, mocking presence in my home. I felt like I was losing her. No, that wasn't right. I had already lost her. I just hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I had created an angel, only to watch her be charmed by a devil who wore my face. The storm broke on a Tuesday night. It had been raining all day. A cold, miserable downpour that matched the atmosphere inside the apartment perfectly. The rain hammered against the window panes, a relentless, percussive rhythm counting down to a confrontation I knew was inevitable. Fiona was out, having claimed she needed to gather some atmospheric energy readings, which I knew was a lie. She was giving us space. She was a master manipulator, and she knew that sometimes the most effective move is to leave the board entirely and let your opponent self-destruct. I was in the kitchen, pretending to read a scientific journal, but the words were just black squiggles on the page. Gia was curled up on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the rain-streaked city lights. The silence between us was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the storm. "Frank." I looked up. "Yeah." She turned to look at me. Her beautiful face etched with a pain and confusion that tore at my heart. Her eyes were shimmering with unshed tears. "We need to talk." I put the journal down, my stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. "Okay." She took a shaky breath. "I'm so confused. Everything is happening so fast. Fiona." She tells me about her world, about a place where I would fit, where I wouldn't have to hide or explain myself. She hugged the blanket tighter around her. "And then there's you." She paused, and I held my breath. "You did this for me," she continued, her voice trembling. "You gave me this life, this body. You were so kind, so gentle. I started to feel things for you. Frank, things I've never felt for anyone." My heart leaped and then immediately plummeted. This was it, the precipice. "But you're so distant now," she said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "You look at me and I don't know what you see. Do you see me?" Or do you just see your project? Do you regret it? No, I said, the word coming out as a strangled whisper. Never. Then what is it? She pleaded, her voice rising. What are you so afraid of? The question hung in the air between us. A stark and simple challenge. And I was a coward. I was a scientist who dealt in facts and figures. Not messy. Terrifying emotions. I loved her more than I had ever loved anything in my life. But the words were trapped behind a wall of fear and insecurity. Fear of what our relationship would mean. Fear of my own role in her life. Fear of Fiona. Fear of everything. She stood up and walked over to me, stopping just a few feet away. The rain lashed against the window. A dramatic soundtrack to the breaking of my own world. I have to ask you something. Frank, she said, her voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper. And I need you to be honest with me. Please. I could only nod, my throat tight. She looked me straight in the eye, her gaze pinning me, demanding a truth I didn't know if I had the courage to give. If this is permanent, if I stay a woman forever, could you love me? Would you love me? It was the ultimate question, the only question that mattered. And I froze. My brain, my stupid, analytical, cowardly brain, went into overdrive. Love her. But she was Gary. I'm not gay. But she's not Gary now. She's Gia. But I created her. Is it ethical? What would people say? What would it mean? All the wrong questions, all the static and noise of a man terrified of his own heart. I saw the hope in her eyes, the desperate plea for me to just say yes, to tear down the walls and meet her where she stood. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed. I stammered, looking away, unable to meet her gaze. I don't know. The words, once spoken, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. I had never said anything more cruel or stupid in my entire life. I saw the light in her eyes die. I saw her beautiful, hopeful face crumple, as if I had physically struck her. Her heart didn't just break, I heard it shatter. It was a sound louder than the thunder outside. A quiet sob escaped her lips. She took a step back. Then another. As if my presence was suddenly toxic. At that exact moment, the apartment door opened. Fiona stood there, shaking a few drops of rain from her violet hair, a small triumphant smile on her face. She had timed her entrance perfectly. She took in the scene, Gia's shattered expression, my horrified regret, and her smile widened. She walked over to Gia, ignoring me completely. She gently took Gia's hand, her touch comforting and sure. He can't give you what you need. My dear, Fiona said, her voice a soft, seductive murmur. He's too afraid. He sees a complication. I see a universe of possibilities. She looked into Gia's tear-filled eyes. Come with me. Gia, come to my world. I will love you for exactly who you are, for the magnificent woman you chose to become. Fiona held out her other hand. It was an invitation, an escape, a promise of everything I had failed to offer. And Gia, lost in her despair, her heart in pieces on the floor, took her hand. Seeing Gia take Fiona's hand did something to me. The fear, the indecision, the cowardice, it all burned away in a sudden, blinding flash of rage and despair. It was the kind of desperate, primal fury that only comes from absolute loss. I had created a miracle, fallen in love with her, and then driven her into the arms of my own twisted reflection with my pathetic weakness. And in that moment, I hated the Genesis engine. I hated the gleaming chrome pod, the humming servers, the very science that had made all of this possible. It was the source of my triumph and the instrument of my agony. If I couldn't have Gia, then the thing that created her, the thing that had brought Fiona here, had to be destroyed. No, I snarled, the word tearing from my throat. I didn't go after them. I turned and sprinted for the lab. I grabbed the first heavy tool I could find, a large, industrial-grade wrench I used for tightening the coolant fittings. It was heavy in my hand. a solid, tangible object in a world that had become a nightmare. "Frank, what are you doing?" I heard Fiona shout from behind me, her voice laced with genuine alarm for the first time. I ignored her. I raised the wrench high over my head and brought it down with all my strength on the main console. The screen shattered, sending a shower of glass and sparks across the room. I swung again, this time at the reinforced glass of the pod itself. It cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from the point of impact. "Stop! You have no idea what you're doing," Fiona screamed. "You'll cause a complete reality collapse." Her warning was gasoline on the fire. "I don't care," I roared, swinging the wrench again and again. A madman bent on destruction. I smashed into the delicate quantum emitters, shattered the control panels, and ripped cables from their sockets. The machine shrieked in protest. The lights flickered wildly, and the deep, resonant hum of the engine warped into a discordant, agonizing groan. Purple energy, raw and untamed, began to arc between the broken components. The air grew thick and tasted of metal. The energy wasn't contained anymore. It lashed out, a chaotic violet tendril of pure quantum force. It struck the ceiling, leaving a charred black scorch mark, and then it found a target. Gia was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of terror, still holding Fiona's hand. The tendril of energy whipped through the air and struck her square in the chest. She screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure agony, and arched her back. The purple energy enveloped her, crackling over her skin like 1,000 tiny lightning bolts. Her body began to convulse violently, her limbs jerking in unnatural directions. And then the change began to happen in reverse. It was a grotesque parody of her beautiful transformation. I watched in frozen horror as her soft curves began to recede, her hips narrowing, her waist thickening, her breasts shrank away, disappearing back into a flat, masculine chest. Her long, beautiful brown hair seemed to retreat back into her scalp, shortening by the inch, until it was nothing more than Gary's familiar close-cropped style. Her skin roughened, her hands broadened, her voice, crying out in pain, dropped octave by octave until it was a deep, masculine groan of agony. The process was not gentle. It was violent, a tearing, shredding desecration of the woman she had become. It was the universe itself violating her, ripping her identity away, cell by painful cell. Fiona saw the situation for what it was, a complete, uncontrollable disaster. She looked at the writhing form on the floor, at the out-of-control energy arcs, and at me, standing amidst the wreckage like a mad god. She made a calculated decision, with a look of pure fury and disgust directed at me. She turned, and a shimmering portal, identical to the one she'd arrived through, tore open behind her. Without a backward glance, she stepped through it, and was gone. The portal snapped shut, leaving only the chaos she had helped create. The energy surge from the dying machine finally sputtered out, in the sudden, ringing silence. The figure on the floor collapsed, the pink silk dress, now ridiculously out of place, hung loosely on a male frame. Gia was gone. Gary lay there, curled in a fetal position, shaking and sobbing. The rage vanished, replaced by a cold, crushing wave of grief and regret so profound it brought me to my knees. I crawled over to him, my hands shaking. "Gary," I whispered. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and terror. He was himself again, but the light, the joy, the completeness I had seen in Gia was gone. He looked broken. I reached out and pulled him into my arms, holding him tightly as he sobbed against my chest. The silk of the dress was bunched up between us. My own tears started to fall, hot and shameful. The truth, the simple, terrifying truth I had been too much of a coward to say before, came pouring out of me in a desperate, broken torrent. "I love you," I choked out, my voice raw with anguish. I clutched him tighter, as if I could physically hold him together. "I'm so sorry." I love you. Whether you're Gary or Gia, whether you're a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. It was always you. I love you. Just you. It was the confession that should have saved us. But it had come too late. It was just an epitaph for the beautiful woman I had created, and then destroyed. The 3 months that followed were a quiet, fragile reconstruction. We didn't talk about that night. We couldn't. The memory was too raw. A gaping wound in the center of our lives. I dismantled what was left of the Genesis engine, packing the broken pieces away like evidence from a crime scene. The lab became a storage room. The door kept permanently closed. Gary and he was Gary again. Most of the time was quiet. Withdrawn. The vibrant, joyful spark that had defined Gia was gone, buried under a heavy blanket of trauma and confusion. He put away the dresses, the makeup, the remnants of his other life. We fell into a routine that was both new and old, navigating the awkward spaces between what we had been and what we had become. But the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. My confession that night, as late and as tragically timed as it was, had changed everything. The love I was too afraid to name was finally out in the open, and slowly, tentatively. Gary began to accept it. Our relationship was rebuilt, not on the foundation of our old friendship, but on the rubble of our shared catastrophe. It was a strange, sad, and deeply loving partnership. One day, about a month in, I came home from work to find him in the living room, wearing one of my old oversized sweaters and a pair of simple leggings. He had a touch of mascara on, just enough to define his eyes. He looked like an echo of both people, a perfect, beautiful synthesis of Gary and Gia. "Some days," he said softly, not looking at me, "I don't feel like either of them. Or maybe I feel like both." That was the day we learned a new term, gender fluid. It was the only word that seemed to fit. Gary wasn't a man who wanted to be a woman anymore. He was something more complex, more beautiful. He was a person who existed on a spectrum, and his identity could shift from one day to the next. And I loved him. I loved Gary, the quiet, thoughtful man who still liked watching football on Sundays. And I loved Gia, the vibrant, graceful woman who began to re-emerge on the days he felt more feminine. Sometimes he was Gary, sometimes she was Gia. Often, he was someone in between, and I loved every single version. Our life was chaotic, unpredictable, and filled with a quiet, hard-won warmth. We were healing. Then, one evening, I was cleaning out the last of the debris from the lab. Tucked away under a scorched floor panel, I found a small folded piece of paper. It was made of a strange, slightly iridescent material I didn't recognize. I unfolded it. There were only 8 words, written in Fiona's elegant, precise script. "The gateway will reopen in 10 years. A chill went down my spine. 10 years. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A countdown. She was coming back. I crumpled the note in my fist, my heart pounding. For a moment, I considered showing it to Gary. But I couldn't. We had found a fragile piece, and I wouldn't be the one to shatter it again. I shoved the note deep into my pocket, a secret I would carry alone. Later that night, I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, straightening the collar of my shirt. For a split second, my reflections seemed to shift. The lighting, the angle, something was off. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. And then I saw her. For less than a heartbeat, my own tired face was gone. In its place was Fiona's. Her violet eyes met mine in the reflection. She smiled. A slow, knowing, and utterly confident smirk. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. My own reflection stared back at me, pale and shaken. I stumbled back from the sink, my hand flying to my chest. Was I losing my mind? Was it just a hallucination, a trick of trauma and light? But then I heard it, a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible, but I would know it anywhere. It was the sound that had started everything. Crack. The sound of breaking glass. Very, very quiet. A cycle hadn't just ended, a new one had just begun. And this time, I would be ready.